75%. That is the share of Canadian merchandise exports that goes to the United States, nearly 1/4 of the entire Canadian economy, crossing a single border, under a single agreement. On July 1, 2026, the United States looked Canada in the eye and said it would not renew that agreement in its current form. And with the stroke of a non-renewal, a trade agreement comes into force across North America. It is called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and for Canada, it is not just a trade deal. It is the architecture of the modern Canadian economy, a country of 36 million people, sitting next to the largest consumer market on Earth, with the longest land border on the planet and an economy built on energy, automotive, manufacturing, lumber, steel, aluminum, and agricultural exports, most of which move south. The deal says, free flow. Over the next 30 years, Canada builds around that fact the way you build around load-bearing walls. Automotive plants in Windsor and Oshawa connect to assembly lines in Ohio. Albertan oil flows through pipelines to American refineries. Canadian steel becomes American bridges. The two economies do not merely trade, they interlock. In 2020, NAFTA becomes CUSMA, renegotiated by Donald Trump, signed by all three parties, hailed as historic. Built into CUSMA is a 6-year review clause. A mandatory check-in date, July 1, 2026. All three parties must declare whether they want to extend the deal for another 16 years. Canada says yes. Mexico says yes. And on July 1, 2026, at a virtual meeting of trade representatives from all three countries, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer reads 5 sentences aloud. 5 sentences. The deal is not renewed. I'm talking about CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, which governs $2.5 trillion in annual trade across North America, and which now, as of July 1, 2026, enters a period of annual reviews rather than the 16-year extension Canada and Mexico both sought. CUSMA is not terminated. The deal remains in force, but the mechanism that replaced it, annual joint reviews, running until 2030, it said, the United States did not agree to renew the USMCA in its current form. The non-renewal is not the earthquake. The annual review mechanism is. When legal experts at the Eurasia Group named this scenario, which they called Zombie USMCA, one of their top 10 global risks for 2026, they weren't worried about the immediate tariff impact. They were worried about what Barry Appleton, co-director of the Center for International Law at New York Law School, called the principal danger. Not that CUSMA terminates in 2026, but that the Bank of Canada had already linked the trade uncertainty leading up to July 1 to 5 consecutive quarters of declining business investment. Canadian GDP contracted on an annualized basis in both the fourth quarter of 2025 and the first quarter of 2026. Business capital investment fell 0.7% in the first quarter of 2026. Its 5th consecutive quarterly decline, and that was before the non-renewal. What comes after is not a cliff, it is a pressure cooker. Every year. So, whether you live in Ontario, work in automotive manufacturing, or energy, or just pay taxes anywhere in this country, what's unfolding right now in Ottawa matters to you. Because this pattern has a very predictable ending, and we've seen it play out before. This is Inc. Tribune, and this is where we follow the money. Subscribe and hit that like button if you want more of this. And here's my question for the comments. When 75% of your exports go to one country and that country just put your trade agreement on annual probation, what exactly is Canada's plan B, and does it actually exist? Drop it below. Let's get into it. Free trade between Canada and the United States began with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement in 1989. Mexico was added in 1994 through NAFTA. For 3 decades, that framework underpinned everything. Following the entry into force of NAFTA, bilateral Canada-US trade grew at an accelerated pace through the 1990s and into the 2000s. By 2024, Canada and the United States exchanged $736.9 billion in goods annually. Canada became, again, the second largest source of merchandise imports into the United States, behind only Mexico. The Canadian automotive sector alone, anchored by Stellantis, Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and Honda, supports over 125,000 direct jobs. In 2020, NAFTA was replaced by CUSMA after Trump's first-term renegotiation. CUSMA is 1,500 pages long, more than double NAFTA's page count. It raised the regional content requirement for duty-free vehicles from 62.5% to 75%. It required automobiles to be built using at least 70% North American steel and aluminum. It included a built-in sunset clause, a mandatory 6-year review in 2026, after which all three parties had to confirm whether they wanted to extend the deal to 2042 or enter the annual review mechanism. On July 1, 2026, the United States confirmed. Here is what happened on July 1, 2026. Representatives from Canada, the United States, and Mexico convened virtually, not in person, not in a formal diplomatic summit, Not in a room with cameras and handshakes. Virtually, Canada and Mexico arrived, having both formally declared their intention to extend CUSMA for 16 years. The United States declined. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer issued this statement. The United States will continue to engage with Mexico and Canada to address the agreement's shortcomings and our trade deficits with these countries. However, the agreement remains in force pending resolution of these issues, or until the agreement's termination. Read that again. Until the agreement's termination. That phrase is in the official United States government statement. The framing from both the U.S. administration and many Canadian economists in the days after was carefully calibrated. Nothing changes immediately. CUSMA remains in force. Tariff schedules don't move today. Trade doesn't stop at the border tomorrow morning. The agreement has 10 years remaining. Prime Minister Mark Carney, in the days before the deadline, struck a tone of deliberate calm. What I've seen with the president is that you're not close to making a deal, and then you make a deal. But here's the thing about that framing. Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charette, called July 1st a checkpoint, not a cliff. That distinction is technically accurate. It is also precisely the kind of language that lowers the guard. Because a checkpoint is not a destination. A checkpoint is a place where someone else decides whether you can keep moving. And the United States has now reserved the right to make that decision every 12 months, with a 6-month exit clause on the side. Canada can negotiate until 2036. But the U.S. doesn't have to wait until 2036 to walk away. That asymmetry is the story. When NAFTA was renegotiated in 2018, Canada spent 14 months in talks that included Trump threatening to exclude Canada from the deal entirely and proceed bilaterally with Mexico. Canada made real concessions on dairy, on dispute resolution mechanisms, and the final agreement was signed with Canada having surrendered more than it publicly acknowledged. Automotive sector exports fell 5%. All of this happened while CUSMA was technically still in force. The agreement provided a framework, and the United States imposed tariffs anyway on sectors it designated as national security concerns under Section 232, which exists outside CUSMA's tariff rules. Canada retaliated with 25% counter tariffs on American goods. Both sides escalated, and CUSMA watched from the sidelines. The trade deal did not protect Canada then. The annual review mechanism gives the United States even more leverage now. All the tools, all the pressure, all the exits. Canada is negotiating, and the United States is holding the terms. Prime Minister Mark Carney's public response in the days before and after July 1st was measured. "We're not going to sign a bad deal," he said on June 25th, responding to U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra's public statement that Canada and it will take some time. That is the Prime Minister's timeline for resolving a question that directly governs nearly 1/4 of the entire Canadian GDP. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, after the July 1st meeting, issued a statement saying all parties agreed on the importance of continuing our discussions. Mexico and the U.S. had already scheduled bilateral talks for the week of July 20th. Canada had not yet scheduled formal bilateral talks as of the non-renewal. LeBlanc noted that substantive discussions still needed to address sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, automotive goods, and lumber. None of those issues are resolved. None have a timeline. And CUSMA, the deal that governs $2.5 trillion in annual North American trade, is now on 12-month probation. The sum of Canadian imports and exports was 2/3 of its gross domestic product in 2024, compared to just 1/4 for the United States. Canada is, by almost every measure, the more exposed party in this negotiation. It has no alternative partner that approaches the scale of the American market. No other country or region accounts for more than 5% of Canada's export volumes. Meanwhile, Canadian exports to the U.S. fell 3.7% in 2025 under existing tariff pressures. Business capital investment fell for 5 consecutive quarters through Q1 2026. Non-residential business investment declined for 2 straight years. Stack that on top of the sectoral tariffs already in place. 25% on non-CUSMA compliant vehicles from Canada. 25% on non-CUSMA compliant auto parts. 25% on steel and aluminum from Canada under Section 232. These tariffs are not covered by CUSMA's general framework. They exist in parallel. And now the general framework itself is on annual review. The United States' exposure to the Canadian market, by comparison, is roughly 6% of its GDP. For a country managing $2.42 trillion in annual economic output dependent on a bilateral trade relationship with a partner 20 times its size, that isn't bad luck. That's arithmetic. I'll call her Linda, not her real name, but her situation is real for hundreds of thousands of people across this country. Linda is 40. She works in a Tier 2 automotive parts supplier in Windsor, Ontario, about 2 kilometers from the Ambassador Bridge. Her plant makes pressed steel components. They go to a General Motors assembly line in Michigan. The parts cross the border 4 times in a single production week before they end up in a vehicle. That is not unusual. That is how the integrated North American automotive supply chain works. Or worked. Linda's plant has been running at reduced capacity since the Section 232 tariffs on steel arrived in 2025. Her employer cut her shift from 5 days to 4. She has not been laid off, but the overtime that used to pay for her daughter's college fund is gone. Her plant manager told the team in June that they were watching the CUSMA review closely. He didn't say what happens if it goes badly. He didn't have to. She's not losing her job this month, but she's watching the floor get a little thinner every single year, and she knows exactly what that eventually leads to.